Early last century, these sinister ghost encounters were experienced around a farmhouse in riverside Oakville, Missouri. A gentleman farmer named Mr. Walsingham had purchased a farm which initially appeared a very good investment. For a few months after moving in, his family had lived there peaceably until a sudden emergence of unexplained noises which immediately made their sleep impossible. Furniture was overturned and their doorbell rung loudly and incessantly. Being practical people, the family attributed these phenomena to vexatious neighbours, but this theory was soon abandoned. The family owned a huge mastiff dog named Don Caesar, who was dedicated to protecting them. However, the nightly disturbances and resulting sleep deprivation were starting to get to him, as he appeared to do battle with invisible intruders. One morning, his perpetual vigilance resulted in a tragic fate. He was seen in the hall, barking savagely while bristling with rage, his eyes fixed on some presence facing him off. At last, the courageous animal leapt forward, only to be thrown back, seemingly throttled and flung down by a strong hand. His neck was broken. Strangely, the sinister presence was on good terms with the house cat, who seemed to have some kind of rapport with the supernatural being. The cat was often seen intently watching something invisible, following its movement with its eyes. The cat would stand near one of the doors as if showing in some visitor, and would occasionally jump into a vacant chair, purring and rubbing itself against the invisible occupant. This bizarre behaviour was definitely preferable to what was to follow. One night, Walsingham's daughter Amelia was brushing her hair and applying cream to her face before going to bed. She felt a hand laid gently on her shoulder and, thinking it belonged to her mother or sister, glanced into the mirror. At first, she was startled to see no reflection but her own, but on looking again, realised that a man's hand was lying on her arm. She was shocked to see a hideous disembodied hand covered on the back with coarse black hair. Her screaming brought her family up the stairs, only to see that it had disappeared. Told by all that she must have dreamt it, Amelia then wondered if she had momentarily snoozed, and that the hand was part of a nightmare. However, further incidents were to occur. One morning, Mr. Walsingham was walking through the garden, which sloped down to the river's edge. Unnervingly, he suddenly noticed footsteps forming next to his own and showing up plainly in the light soil. The footsteps were those of a man's naked feet. That same evening saw the occurrence of another bizarre incident. Some friends were having supper with the Walsinghams when suddenly a loud groan was heard from the room above them. While those at the table glanced from face to face, Mrs. Walsingham noted a stain of something moist and red growing in the middle of the white tablecloth. In astonishment, she looked upwards and watched as a ruddy liquid slowly dripped down on the table from the ceiling. Everyone stopped eating to stare at the slow descent of the red drops until Mr. Walsingham and some guests ran upstairs to the room directly above the dining room to discover the source of this gruesome dripping. The floor of the upstairs room was completely covered, but he ripped up the carpet, only to find the floorboards completely dry and covered with a thin top layer of dust. There was no trace of any blood, which, however, continued to slowly drip onto the table below. Some still sitting at the table underneath watched the continuous drip, drip, while the stain grew to the size of a large dinner plate before it stopped. The witnesses later confirmed that the stain was examined the next day under a microscope and pronounced to be human blood. The Walsinghams left the farm as soon as possible, abandoning the building to the unseen forces. Of course, tales of the psychic occurrences began to circulate, and soon a local youth accepted a challenge to take them on. Horace Gunn was wagered that he would be unable to spend 24 hours alone in the haunted house. That he eventually did so was tempered by his latest statement that not all the money in the USA would induce him to pass another night there. The following incidents occurred. Horace Gunn arrived at the farm shortly after twilight and began to kindle a fire in one of the rooms. He had brought a lamp with him, but when he tried to light it, an icy breath, seemingly from someone standing beside him, blew out each match as soon as he struck it. The same thing happened when he tried to start a fire. Undeterred, and also afraid of public opinion, Gunn was determined to ride out the inconvenience. For some time, all was quiet in the house, when suddenly a yell of pain came from the cellars underneath. This seemed to trigger a general pandemonium. Running feet clattered up and down the stairs like a frenzied chase which lasted well over an hour. When it ceased, the young man continued to sit there in the darkness until his attention was caught by a luminous white spot which gradually materialized on the wall in front of him. It continued to lighten until it finally blazed as a disc of white fire. Terrified, Gunn saw that the light encircled a human head, which moved disembodied slowly along the wall at about the height of a person above the floor. The dreadful head was covered with long grey hair that was matted together over one temple with clots of blood from a jagged wound. The expression on the face was of extreme suffering and misery, the glowing, wide-open eyes fixed firmly on the young man. Eventually the head disappeared, leaving him in darkness again. Gunn finally decided that he wanted to leave, groping his way along the dark wall to find the door. He had nearly reached it when he was seized by the ankle and thrown violently to the floor. Clammy hands encircled his throat, and despite his struggles, he was choked into unconsciousness. Come daylight, and some of Gunn's high-spirited friends drove out from Oakville to check on the outcome of their wager. They were surprised not to be greeted by him, and even more so when their knocking did not bring him to the door. They finally forced an entrance and hurried into the dining room, where they found him lying on the floor, still out to it. Trying to rouse him, they found his neck black and swollen and covered with the marks of long, thin fingers ending in hooked nails. They revived their friend with some difficulty, but Horace Gunn never recovered from the shock of his one foray into psychic investigation. The farm was finally completely abandoned to the evil entities possessing it. Who or what they were was unknown, as the location's previous 70-year history was known to be uneventful and benign. It was recalled by Mr. Walsingham that 3 months after he purchased the farm, some bones were unearthed in the corner of a small field. While the bones were declared to be human, Mr. Walsingham disagreed, and they were thrown into an adjacent lime kiln, where they were quickly consumed. The hauntings did not begin until after the discovery and disposal of the bones, so perhaps the outraged spirit of their owner saw fit to punish the Walsinghams for this lack of respect. The strange story was well authenticated in its day, and long accounts appeared in the press. The editors of the 1936 book True Ghost Stories, where it was published, claim it to be one of the first American hauntings to be reported. An interesting aside was that the different responses of cats and dogs to psychic phenomena appear the same the world over. Do you agree with this? We'd love to hear of your opinions or experiences below.